Ma'am, you need to leave this neighborhood immediately or you're going to be arrested for trespassing and harassment. I don't care what your agency told you. The homeowner says you were threatening her, refusing to leave her property when asked.
That's not true. I'm a nanny. I work for Premier Childcare Services.
We've received a complaint about harassment and trespassing.
I wasn't harassing anyone. I had a meeting scheduled with that woman at 3:30 today.
You're saying you have an appointment, but the homeowner says she's never seen you before.
Call my agency. They'll confirm everything.
The body camera timestamp reads 3:47 p.m. on June 15, 2024, and Officer Brett Callahan's face fills the frame with that particular expression of absolute certainty that comes from someone who's already decided who to believe and who to dismiss before bothering to examine any actual evidence. And in this case, the person he's decided to believe is the white homeowner standing on her porch with her arms crossed and a satisfied smirk playing at the corners of her mouth, while the person he's dismissing, the person whose documentation he's glanced at for approximately 3 seconds before deciding it must be fake or irrelevant, is 28-year-old Tanisha Reeves, a professional nanny with a degree in early childhood education from Howard University, holding her agency identification badge, her verified work assignment printed on official letterhead, and a confirmation email with this exact address clearly visible on her phone screen, all of which apparently matter less to this officer than the word of a woman who's claiming she's never seen Tanisha before in her life, even though that claim is a demonstrable, provable, recorded lie. The white homeowner is Melissa Thornton, 36 years old, stay-at-home mother of 2 children, resident of the exclusive Westbrook Estates neighborhood where houses sell for upwards of $1 million and where the demographic composition is so overwhelmingly white that Tanisha's presence walking down the sidewalk had apparently been noteworthy enough that neighbors were watching her through their windows and texting each other about the suspicious black woman going door to door. Melissa knows exactly who Tanisha is, because just 3 days ago Melissa personally contacted Premier Childcare Services, filled out a detailed application requesting a full-time nanny for her children aged 4 and 7, conducted a phone interview with Tanisha where they discussed schedules and responsibilities and child development philosophies, and explicitly scheduled this meeting for today at 3:30 p.m. at her home address to finalize the arrangement and introduce Tanisha to the children she'd be caring for starting Monday morning. But when Tanisha showed up at that door at the scheduled time, when Melissa got her first in-person look at what this highly qualified, extensively background-checked, thoroughly vetted nanny actually looked like, when she saw Tanisha's dark brown skin and her natural hair and her features that apparently didn't conform to whatever Eurocentric beauty standards Melissa had been expecting, she made a split-second decision that would ultimately cost her millions of dollars and destroy her comfortable suburban life. She decided that she'd rather lie to this woman's face, rather lie to the police, rather commit multiple crimes including filing a false police report and making defamatory statements, than admit that she'd hired a black woman she now considered too ugly and too dark-skinned to be around her children, because in Melissa's racist calculus it was better to create a completely fabricated narrative about a threatening stranger harassing her than to simply say, "I've changed my mind," and deal with the consequences of breaking a legitimate employment agreement. What Melissa doesn't know, what she can't possibly know because Tanisha was careful and subtle when she pulled her phone from her purse and activated the voice recording app while Melissa was in the middle of one of her racist tirades, is that their entire porch conversation has been documented in crystal clear audio, every racial slur and every degrading comment captured with time stamps and perfect clarity, creating evidence that will be played in courtrooms and on national news broadcasts and that will follow Melissa Thornton for the rest of her life whenever anyone Googles her name. She doesn't know that Premier Childcare Services isn't a small, easily intimidated operation that will quietly absorb this discrimination and move on, but rather a well-established agency with deep pockets, an aggressive legal team, and a zero-tolerance policy for clients who abuse or discriminate against their employees. And she definitely doesn't know that Officer Brett Callahan's decision to arrest Tanisha despite clear documentation that she had every right to be at that address, despite evidence that Melissa's accusations were false, and despite his partner's quiet suggestion that maybe they should verify the story before making an arrest, will result in both Melissa and Officer Callahan being named as co-defendants in a $12 million lawsuit that will become a national case study in how racial discrimination and police complicity can destroy innocent lives but also, when properly fought with evidence and institutional support, can lead to justice and accountability and consequences for people who think their racism will be protected by their privilege. But before we get to the moment when Melissa Thornton's smug satisfaction transforms into panic as she realizes her lies are about to be exposed, before we see Officer Callahan suspended and facing federal civil rights charges that will end his career, Before we understand how one woman's racism and one cop's biased policing created a perfect storm of injustice that will ultimately result in financial ruin and public humiliation for both of them, we need to go back to the beginning of Tanisha's day to understand how she ended up knocking on 5 different doors in a neighborhood where she clearly wasn't welcome, to see exactly what was said on that porch that Melissa thought she could lie about with impunity, and to recognize how everything went so catastrophically wrong so quickly simply because a racist woman thought she could weaponize the police against a black woman who'd done absolutely nothing wrong except show up for a job interview that the racist woman herself had scheduled. If powerful stories, voices, and black triumphs matter to you, subscribe to Bold Black Watch TV. Like, comment, and share so these stories travel further. Tanisha Reeves had spent her entire professional life building a career that her mother could be proud of, and that weight, that sense of responsibility to honor the sacrifices that had been made for her, shaped every decision she made and every goal she pursued with the kind of focused determination that comes from growing up watching someone you love work themselves to exhaustion trying to give you opportunities they never had. Her mother, Lorraine Reeves, had raised Tanisha alone after Tanisha's father had died in a construction accident when Tanisha was only 3 years old, and Lorraine had worked 3 jobs simultaneously for years, cleaning office buildings at night, working retail during the day, doing weekend catering gigs whenever she could get them, all so that Tanisha and her 2 younger siblings could live in a decent neighborhood with decent schools and have a chance at a life that wasn't defined by financial precarity and limited options. Tanisha had been 12 years old when she'd fully understood what her mother was sacrificing, had come home from school one day to find Lorraine asleep on the couch in her cleaning company uniform, having worked a double shift and then come home to make dinner for her 3 children before collapsing from exhaustion. And Tanisha had made a promise to herself that day that she would make it worth it, would achieve something significant enough to justify all those sacrificed hours and all that bone-deep weariness that her mother carried but never complained about. She'd thrown herself into school with the intensity of someone who understood that education was the only ladder out of the circumstances they'd been born into, and she'd graduated high school with honors and a full scholarship to Howard University, where she'd majored in early childhood education because working with children felt like a calling rather than just a career path. The decision to become a nanny rather than a traditional classroom teacher had been deliberate and strategic. Private childcare paid significantly better than public school teaching, especially when you worked for the kind of affluent families who could afford to pay premium rates for educated, experienced caregivers, and Tanisha had calculated that she could make more money as a senior nanny with a prestigious agency than she ever would as a public school teacher with a master's degree and 10 years of experience. It wasn't the path that most people with her educational credentials chose, and she'd had professors at Howard question whether she was wasting her degree by going into private domestic work, but Tanisha understood something that her well-meaning professors didn't. There was no shame in domestic work when you did it professionally and when you were compensated fairly, and the families who hired nannies through agencies like Premier Childcare Services were paying for expertise in education, not just babysitting. She'd been with Premier Childcare for 6 years now, had worked for 5 different families during that time, and every single one of them, all white, all wealthy, all living in neighborhoods and communities where Tanisha was usually the only black face for blocks in any direction, had given her glowing references and had tried to convince her to stay when she'd moved on to new positions that offered better compensation or more convenient schedules. She'd cared for infants and toddlers and school-age children, had helped kids with homework and taught them to read and taken them to music lessons and sports practices, had been present for first words and first steps and all the small daily miracles of child development, and she was genuinely good at what she did in ways that transcended mere competence and entered the realm of actual talent and calling. 3 months ago, Premier Childcare had promoted her to senior nanny status, a designation reserved for their most experienced and credentialed employees and one that came with a significant pay increase that had finally allowed Tanisha to start saving seriously for a down payment on her first home. She was making $65,000 a year now, which was good money though not extravagant, and she was sending a portion of every paycheck home to her mother to help cover Lorraine's medical expenses because diabetes and the complications that came with it weren't cheap to manage even with insurance. And Tanisha had made a promise to herself years ago that her mother would never have to work 3 jobs again, that once Tanisha was established in her career she would take over the financial burden and give Lorraine the rest and security she'd never had the luxury of enjoying. The assignment that would change her life had come through the agency on Wednesday, June 12th, when the placement coordinator had called Tanisha to let her know that a new client had requested her specifically after reviewing her profile and qualifications. The client was Melissa Thornton, a stay-at-home mother in the Westbrook Estates neighborhood, and she needed a full-time nanny starting immediately for her 2 children. Aiden, who was 7, and Emma, who was 4. The requirements that Melissa had listed in her application were straightforward. Experienced with school-age children, patient, educated, familiar with positive discipline techniques, comfortable with an active household, able to work Monday through Friday from 7 in the morning until 6 in the evening. Tanisha had fit every one of those requirements perfectly, and when the agency had arranged a phone interview between her and Melissa for that same afternoon, Tanisha had prepared carefully, reviewing child development strategies and thinking through how she'd answer questions about her philosophy and approach. The phone conversation had lasted 45 minutes and had gone remarkably well. Melissa had asked intelligent questions about how Tanisha handled behavioral issues, what her approach was to screen time and educational activities, how she balanced structure and flexibility in daily routines, and Tanisha had provided detailed, thoughtful answers that demonstrated both her education and her practical experience. Melissa had seemed impressed and satisfied by the end of the call, had told Tanisha, "You sound absolutely perfect for what we need," and had suggested they meet in person on Friday afternoon so that Tanisha could see the house, meet the children, and finalize all the details before starting work the following Monday. They'd scheduled the meeting for 3:30 p.m. at Melissa's address, 2847 Maple Ridge Drive, and Tanisha had hung up feeling optimistic about the placement because Melissa had seemed professional and reasonable and like someone who would value Tanisha's expertise and treat her with respect. What Tanisha hadn't known, what she couldn't have known because the phone conversation had been audio only and because Melissa's prejudices were the kind that only manifested when confronted with visible racial difference, was that Melissa Thornton's social media presence told a very different story about who she was and what she believed. Her Facebook and Instagram accounts were filled with posts that used coded racial language to complain about crime and property values and neighborhood safety, with shares of All Lives Matter content and Blue Lives Matter imagery, with comments on local news stories that always seemed to find ways to blame black people for social problems while insisting she wasn't racist and had black friends, even though a careful examination of her social circle would have revealed that claim to be transparently false. Melissa was the kind of racist who would have insisted she wasn't one, who would have pointed to the fact that she'd been willing to interview a black nanny as evidence of her open-mindedness, who genuinely believed that her decision to contact an agency rather than explicitly requesting a white nanny meant she was being fair and progressive, and who had probably told herself during that phone interview with Tanisha that race didn't matter to her and that she was judging purely on qualifications. But the reality that Melissa hadn't confronted until she opened her door on Friday afternoon was that her theoretical colorblindness collapsed instantly when faced with the actual lived reality of a dark-skinned black woman standing on her porch, and in that moment of confrontation between her self-image as a non-racist person and her visceral reaction of disgust and rejection, Melissa had chosen to protect her racism rather than honor her commitments. Friday morning had found Tanisha preparing for the meeting with her usual thoroughness, laying out a professional outfit. A navy blue dress with a matching cardigan, modest and appropriate for a job interview, paired with comfortable flats because she knew from experience that meeting children often involved sitting on floors or walking around neighborhoods, and assembling her portfolio of certifications, background check clearances, and reference letters from previous families. She'd reviewed what she knew about the Thornton family from the agency's files and from her phone conversation with Melissa, had prepared questions about the children's routines and personalities and any special needs or preferences she should be aware of, and had left her apartment with plenty of time to account for traffic and to arrive punctually because she knew from experience that affluent families noticed and appreciated promptness. The drive to Westbrook Estates had taken 40 minutes from her apartment in the city, winding through increasingly affluent neighborhoods until she'd reached the gated entrance to the development where houses started at $800,000 and climbed well over $1 million for the larger properties. The gate had been open, it was the middle of the afternoon and residents were coming and going, so Tanisha had driven through without having to check in with any security, and she'd followed her GPS directions to Maple Ridge Drive, a street of large, well-maintained homes with perfectly manicured lawns and the kind of studied uniformity that expensive planned communities cultivated as markers of exclusivity and status. The problem had started almost immediately, because the GPS had brought her to the correct street but the house numbers were poorly marked, with many homes displaying their addresses in small decorative numbers that were nearly impossible to read from a moving car or even from the sidewalk. Tanisha had driven slowly down the street looking for 2847, had passed several houses without being able to identify their numbers, and had finally decided she needed to park and ask for directions because she was already running 5 minutes late and she didn't want to make a bad first impression by showing up flustered and significantly delayed. What followed was an experience that Tanisha had encountered variations of many times before in her career but that never stopped being uncomfortable and subtly humiliating: the experience of being a black woman in a predominantly white neighborhood trying to conduct legitimate business while being treated as inherently suspicious and unwelcome. She'd knocked on the door of 2821 Maple Ridge Drive, had seen an elderly white woman peer at her through the curtains, and had watched as the woman had simply stared at her for a long moment before walking away without opening the door or offering any assistance. At 2835, a middle-aged white man had answered but had been immediately dismissive when Tanisha had explained she was looking for the Thornton residence, telling her brusquely to check the mailbox numbers, before closing the door without offering to help her identify which direction the numbers were running or how far away 2847 might be. At 2839 she tried using the Ring doorbell camera, and a woman's voice had come through the speaker asking what she wanted, and when Tanisha had explained she was looking for 2847 Maple Ridge Drive for a scheduled appointment, the woman had said, "I can't help you with that," without ever opening her door or making any effort to actually help, leaving Tanisha standing on the porch feeling dismissed and othered in ways that had nothing to do with what she'd actually said or done and everything to do with how she looked and what assumptions these residents were making about her right to be in their neighborhood. The teenager who'd answered the door at 2843 had actually been helpful, had pointed her in the direction of the Thornton's house 4 doors down and had described it as the beige one with the blue shutters. And Tanisha had thanked him genuinely and gratefully before walking to 2845 where she'd knocked one more time just to confirm she had the right house before finally arriving at 2847 at 3:35 p.m., 5 minutes late due to the navigation issues but still professional and prepared and completely unaware that the woman inside that house had already decided not to hire her before they'd ever met face to face. What Tanisha didn't know as she rang the doorbell and waited with her professional smile and her portfolio in hand was that Melissa Thornton had been watching her progress down the street from her upstairs window, had seen Tanisha knocking on neighbors' doors, and had immediately gotten on the phone with her friend Caroline Winters who lived across the street to alert her that there's a black woman going door to door asking questions, and to speculate nervously about whether they should call the police. Caroline had advised Melissa to wait and see what the woman wanted, and Melissa had agreed but had remained anxious and suspicious, watching Tanisha's approach with the kind of hypervigilance that white people in affluent neighborhoods often direct toward black people whose presence they find anomalous and therefore threatening. When Melissa had finally opened her door in response to the doorbell, when she'd gotten her first clear look at Tanisha standing there professional and smiling and holding her portfolio, the expression that had crossed Melissa's face had been unmistakable to anyone who was paying attention. Shock, followed immediately by poorly concealed disgust, followed by a kind of rapid calculation as her brain worked through how to handle this situation in a way that aligned with her racism while still allowing her to maintain her self-image as a reasonable person. And the solution she'd landed on in that split second had been to simply lie, to pretend she'd never hired Tanisha, to claim this was all some kind of mistake or confusion, because in Melissa's privileged worldview it was easier to gaslight a black woman and make her doubt her own reality than it was to admit that she'd made a hiring decision over the phone and was now reneging on it because she didn't like what her new employee looked like in person. Every story here is bold. Every voice matters. If Bold Black Watch TV moved you, hit subscribe, leave a comment, and help us amplify black stories about justice that deserve to be heard. The moment when Tanisha had introduced herself with genuine warmth and professional courtesy. "Hi, Mrs. Thornton. I'm Tanisha Reeves from Premier Childcare Services. We spoke on Wednesday about the nanny position. It's so nice to finally meet you in person." And had been met with Melissa's cold, flat response of, "I'm sorry, I think you have the wrong house. I'm not expecting anyone," was the moment when Tanisha's optimism about this placement had begun to curdle into confusion and concern, because the shift in Melissa's demeanor from the friendly, engaged tone of their phone conversation to this dismissive hostility was so dramatic and so immediate that it could only be explained by one variable that had changed between Wednesday's phone call and Friday's doorstep meeting, and that variable was Melissa seeing Tanisha's face and making instant judgments based on her appearance. Tanisha had tried to maintain her professionalism despite the sudden coldness, had attempted to clarify what she thought must be some kind of misunderstanding. "This is 2847 Maple Ridge Drive, right? I have our meeting scheduled for 3:30. Here's my confirmation email," and she'd started to pull out her phone to show Melissa the email with all the details clearly laid out, but Melissa had cut her off before she could even get her phone fully out of her purse, had said with barely restrained hostility, "I don't know what you're talking about. I never called any agency. You must be confused. and the way she'd emphasized confused had carried an implication that Tanisha was somehow stupid or incompetent rather than someone who'd followed the directions she'd been given by a professional placement agency. The interaction had devolved from there with a speed that would have been almost comical if it weren't so disturbing and so potentially dangerous, because Tanisha had persisted in trying to resolve what she still thought might be a legitimate misunderstanding. She'd shown Melissa the confirmation email on her phone with Melissa's full name, her address, the date and time of their meeting, all the details that should have been impossible to fake or confuse, and Melissa had barely glanced at the screen before dismissing it entirely with, "That's not me. Must be a different Melissa Thornton. This is a mistake," which was such an obvious lie that Tanisha had actually felt a moment of genuine disbelief, because who lies about something so easily disprovable, who stands in their own doorway and claims not to be the person whose name is on the email and whose voice matches the voice from the phone call that happened just 2 days ago? Tanisha had pushed back as carefully as she could while still being clear about what had happened, had said, "Ma'am, I spoke with you on Wednesday. We discussed your children Aiden and Emma, your schedule needs, my experience with this age group," and she'd watched Melissa's face harden at the mention of her children's names, because that was specific information that couldn't be explained away as coincidence or confusion, that proved definitively that Tanisha had spoken with someone in this household and had been given detailed information about the family's needs. But Melissa had doubled down on her lie anyway, had responded with pure hostility, "I don't know who you talked to, but it wasn't me. And you need to leave my property now." The word property had been emphasized with a particular kind of aggressive entitlement, the tone that white homeowners use when they want to remind black people that they're trespassing on white space and that their presence is conditional and revocable at any moment. And Tanisha had felt her professional composure beginning to crack as she'd realized that this wasn't a misunderstanding at all, that Melissa knew exactly who she was and what meeting they'd scheduled, and that this rejection was happening for reasons that had nothing to do with Tanisha's qualifications or credentials and everything to do with her race and her physical appearance. She tried one more time to appeal to reason and professionalism, had said with as much calm as she could muster, "Mrs. Thornton, I drove 40 minutes to get here. I prepared for this meeting. If there's been some misunderstanding," but Melissa had cut her off again, had said, "The only misunderstanding is you showing up at my door," and the contempt in her voice had been so naked and so venomous that it had finally penetrated Tanisha's professional training, and her habitual assumption of good faith had made her understand with absolute clarity that she was dealing with someone who was hostile not because of anything Tanisha had done but because of who Tanisha was. The conversation had shifted then into territory that was more honest but infinitely more ugly, because Tanisha had finally said out loud what she'd been thinking. "I don't understand. On the phone you said I sounded perfect for the position. Has something changed?" And the way she'd emphasized something had made it clear what she was asking about, had put the question directly on the table of whether Melissa's rejection was based on seeing Tanisha's race. Melissa's response had been to double down on her gaslighting, to insist, "Look, I don't know what kind of scam you're running, but you need to leave now," which was such an absurd characterization of what was happening. Tanisha trying to attend a legitimate business meeting that Melissa herself had scheduled, that it would have been laughable except for the very real threat underlying it, the implicit suggestion that if Tanisha didn't leave voluntarily then Melissa would make her leave through force or through police intervention. Tanisha had tried to maintain her dignity, had pulled out her agency identification badge and her background check clearance and had held them up for Melissa to see. "This isn't a scam. I'm a professional nanny. Here's my agency ID, my background check clearance." But Melissa hadn't even looked at them, had instead raised her voice to a near shout, "I said leave. I'm not going to have some. I'm not hiring you. You're not what I'm looking for." And that pause, that moment where Melissa had almost said something explicitly racist before catching herself, had been the clearest indication yet of what was really driving this encounter and why Melissa was so determined to get rid of Tanisha without acknowledging their prior agreement. That was when Tanisha had finally said it explicitly, had named what was happening in clear, unambiguous language. "You did hire me. Or you were going to until you saw what I looked like. This is discrimination." And she'd watched Melissa's face cycle through expressions. First guilt because the accusation was true, then anger because how dare Tanisha call her out on it, then defensive self-righteousness because Melissa had apparently convinced herself that she had every right to discriminate and that being called racist was worse than actually being racist. Melissa's response had been to try to flip the script entirely, to position herself as the victim in this situation. "Discrimination? You show up at my house uninvited?" And Tanisha had interrupted her because that was such a blatant lie, had said with heat in her voice now, "I was invited. You invited me." But Melissa had just talked over her, had continued with, harassing me and now you're playing the race card? Typical. That word, typical, had been loaded with all the racial resentment that Melissa had been trying to keep somewhat coated up until this point, and it was at that moment that Tanisha had made a decision that would ultimately be the most important decision of this entire encounter. The action that would transform this from an unprovable he said she said situation into a documented case of racial discrimination with audio evidence that no one could deny or explain away. She'd quietly reached into her purse, had pulled out her phone with movements that were subtle enough that Melissa wasn't paying close attention, had activated her voice recording app with a few quick taps, and had positioned the phone so that its microphone was capturing everything while the phone itself was partially concealed by her portfolio and her body positioning. And once that recording was active, once Tanisha knew that everything said from this point forward would be documented and preserved and usable as evidence, she'd asked a question that was designed to get Melissa to say explicitly what she'd been dancing around. So you're refusing to honor the agreement we made? The recording had captured Melissa's response with perfect clarity, had recorded her saying, I'm not letting some N*** are into my house around my children. You people always think you're entitled to everything. I'm not having an ape taking care of my kids. Get off my property before I call the police. The slurs had hung in the air between them like physical blows, and Tanisha had felt the impact of them even though she'd heard variations of this kind of language before, because there was something particularly violent about having it directed at you face to face by someone who'd pretended to respect you just 2 days earlier when they couldn't see you. She kept her voice steady though, had responded for the recording's benefit. You just used racial slurs against me. You're refusing service based on my race. This is illegal. And Melissa's response had shown either complete ignorance of the law or complete confidence that the law wouldn't protect Tanisha, because she'd said with smug certainty, it's my house. I can refuse anyone I want for any reason. And my reason is you're ugly and black and I don't want you here. The children, Aiden and Emma, the children Tanisha would have been caring for if their mother weren't a racist who cared more about her prejudices than about her children's well-being, had been visible in the background during this exchange, had been watching through the doorway with confused expressions as their mother screamed slurs at a woman on their porch, and Melissa had noticed them watching and had barked at them to go upstairs, had sent them away from this scene of their mother's ugliness. Without apparently considering what message this was sending them about how to treat people or what words were acceptable to use against black people. Tanisha had recognized at this point that there was no salvaging this situation, that Melissa was beyond reason and that the professional relationship Tanisha had thought they were building was dead before it had ever really begun, and so she'd started backing away from the door while making it clear that she understood what had happened and what the consequences would be. I'm going to report this to my agency. This is clear discrimination and you will face consequences. But Melissa, rather than showing any concern about those promised consequences, had pulled out her own phone with a look of vindictive satisfaction, had announced, you'll face consequences. You're trespassing and harassing me. I'm calling 911. Tanisha had tried to de-escalate, had said clearly, I'm leaving. You don't need to call anyone, because she understood that police involvement could transform this situation from merely horrible into actively dangerous, understood that police showing up to a white woman's report of a black person harassing her was a scenario that had ended badly for black people too many times to count. But Melissa was already dialing, was already launching into her performance for the 911 dispatcher, and Tanisha's recording captured every word of the false report that Melissa made, documented the lies that would later form the basis for criminal charges against Melissa for filing a false police report. 911? Yes, there's a black woman who's been harassing me at my home, Melissa had said, and the way she'd emphasized black woman had made it clear that race was a significant part of her framing of this supposed threat. She's aggressive, she won't leave, I feel threatened. She's been going door to door in the neighborhood. My neighbors have seen her. I don't know what she wants, but I'm scared for my children. Please send someone immediately. Every single word of that report had been a lie. Tanisha had knocked on doors asking for directions, not going door to door in any threatening way. She hadn't been aggressive, she'd been trying to have a professional conversation that Melissa had escalated with her hostility and her slurs. She was leaving voluntarily, not refusing to leave, and the characterization of Melissa as scared was absurd given that she was the one who'd been screaming slurs while Tanisha had maintained her composure and her professionalism throughout. Tanisha had walked to her car while Melissa was still on the phone with 911, had heard Melissa tell the dispatcher, she's walking to a car. I don't know if she has weapons. Please hurry, which was another layer of inflammatory lies designed to make the police response more aggressive and more dangerous for Tanisha. designed to frame her as a violent threat rather than a woman who'd been invited to this address for a job interview and who'd been subjected to racist abuse when she'd arrived. Across the street, Caroline Winters had been watching the entire interaction from her window and had been recording portions of it on her phone, though Tanisha didn't know that yet and wouldn't know it until later when that footage would surface as additional evidence supporting her version of events and contradicting Melissa's lies. Tanisha had reached her car, had gotten into the driver's seat, and had been about to start the engine and leave this nightmare neighborhood when she'd seen the patrol car turn onto Maple Ridge Drive and head directly toward her. And in that moment she'd understood with sinking certainty that this wasn't over, that Melissa's lies had set something in motion that wouldn't be stopped just because Tanisha was voluntarily leaving, and that she was about to experience the danger that comes from being black and being accused by a white woman who knows that police will automatically believe her regardless of what evidence might exist to the contrary. Bold Black Watch TV is more than a channel, it's a community. Subscribe, like this video, and join us as we celebrate justice, truth, culture, and powerful black narratives. Officer Brett Callahan had been a police officer for 14 years, and during that time he'd accumulated a file of complaints about racially biased policing that any competent internal affairs department would have recognized as a pattern requiring intervention and retraining at minimum and termination at maximum. But like many officers with similar patterns of discriminatory behavior, he'd benefited from a department culture that protected problem officers rather than holding them accountable, that dismissed complaints from communities of color as inherently unreliable or motivated by anti-police bias, and that prioritized officer solidarity and institutional loyalty over justice or public safety. The complaints against him included allegations that he'd stopped black drivers for suspicious behavior that he never seemed to notice when white drivers did the same things, that he'd used excessive force during arrests of black suspects while treating white suspects with notable gentleness and patience, and that he'd made racially coded comments during traffic stops that suggested he viewed black people as inherently criminal and threatening regardless of what they were actually doing. All of these complaints had been investigated by internal affairs, and all of them had been dismissed as either unsubstantiated or justified by the circumstances, even though a pattern recognition algorithm or any halfway competent statistical analysis would have shown that Callahan's policing outcomes were racially skewed in ways that couldn't be explained by random chance or by legitimate differences in behavior. He'd survived all those investigations with his career intact and his prejudices unexamined, and he'd learned from the experience that he could continue policing the way he'd always policed, with more skepticism toward black people, with quicker escalation to force against black suspects, with more willingness to believe white accusers over black defenders, and that the system would protect him because that's what the system was designed to do. His partner that day was Officer Jennifer Walsh, a younger officer with 5 years of experience who'd been partnered with Callahan for the past year and who'd developed the unfortunate habit that many junior officers develop when partnered with problematic senior officers, which is the habit of deferring to the senior partner's judgment even when that judgment seems questionable or wrong, of prioritizing partner loyalty and shift harmony over doing the right thing, of telling yourself that it's not your place to challenge someone with more experience even when that person is clearly making biased decisions. Walsh was not herself actively racist in the way that Callahan was, but her passivity and her unwillingness to speak up or push back made her complicit in Callahan's discriminatory policing, made her part of the problem even if she wasn't the primary source of it. They'd received the dispatch call at 3:44 p.m., report of aggressive black female, possible trespassing and harassment, homeowner feels threatened, requesting immediate response. And the framing of that call, the specific language that had been used by both Melissa and the dispatcher, had primed them to approach this situation as a potential threat requiring control rather than as a civil dispute requiring investigation and de-escalation. Callahan had responded with lights on, had driven to Maple Ridge Drive with the kind of urgency that suggested he expected to find an active disturbance, and had pulled up to find Melissa standing on her porch looking agitated while a black woman sat in a car on the street appearing to be preparing to leave. Their first action had been to approach Melissa rather than approaching the accused, which was standard procedure. Talk to the complainant first, get their story, establish what they're alleging, but the way Callahan had approached that conversation had revealed his bias immediately, because he'd treated Melissa with gentle deference and had accepted her characterization of events without any skepticism or any attempt to verify whether her story made sense or aligned with observable evidence. Melissa had launched into her performance with visible distress, had deployed tears that may or may not have been genuine, and had told the officers, "Thank God you're here. That woman showed up claiming to be someone I hired, but I never called any agency. She wouldn't leave when I told her to. She was aggressive and threatening. I was terrified. Callahan had asked the questions that protocol required. Did she threaten you specifically? What did she say? But his tone had been sympathetic and believing rather than investigative, had conveyed from the start that he accepted Melissa's framing of this situation as a threatening black woman harassing an innocent white homeowner. Melissa had provided more details that were pure fabrication. She said if I didn't let her in she'd make me regret it. I have small children inside. I was afraid of what she might do, and none of that had actually happened, but Melissa delivered it with enough apparent sincerity that Callahan had nodded seriously and had made notes as if he were documenting facts rather than lies. Walsh had asked a more specific question. Did she touch you or damage any property? Which was a reasonable question designed to assess whether any actual crime had occurred, and Melissa's answer of no, but she wouldn't leave when I asked her multiple times. Isn't that trespassing? Had contained the first acknowledgement that maybe nothing actually criminal had happened here, but Callahan had responded, where is she now? Without pursuing the question of whether someone can trespass when they're responding to an invitation that the property owner herself had extended, and Melissa had pointed to Tanisha's car with, that car right there. She's sitting in it, probably planning her next move, which was a completely baseless speculation designed to keep framing Tanisha as threatening even though she was visibly preparing to leave. The officers had approached Tanisha's car with their hands positioned near their weapons in that ready-for-threat posture that police adopt when they've already decided someone is dangerous, and Callahan had tapped on her window with the kind of aggressive authority that was designed to intimidate rather than to communicate. When Tanisha had rolled down her window, when they'd gotten their first clear look at her face, they'd seen that she'd been crying, that she was visibly upset and distressed, which should have been the first indication that maybe the threatening aggressor narrative didn't match reality, but Callahan had simply ordered her out of the car without any preamble or any attempt to understand what had actually happened. Ma'am, step out of the vehicle. We've received a complaint about harassment and trespassing. Tanisha had responded as calmly as she could manage given her emotional state, had tried to explain the situation in hopes that these officers would be more reasonable than the racist homeowner. I wasn't harassing anyone. I had a scheduled appointment. There's been a misunderstanding, but Callahan had cut her off with another command rather than a question, had repeated, step out of the vehicle. Now, in a tone that made it clear he wasn't interested in hearing her side of the story before he'd already made his judgments about who to believe and who to dismiss. She'd complied because she understood that refusing direct orders from police could escalate situations dangerously, had gotten out of her car with her hands visible and her movements non-threatening, and had stood there on the street in her professional outfit holding her agency badge and her phone while Callahan had immediately begun interrogating her from a position of assumed guilt. The homeowner says you were threatening her, refusing to leave her property when asked. Tanisha had tried to correct the record, had explained, that's not true. I'm a nanny. I work for Premier Childcare Services. I had a meeting scheduled with that woman at 3:30 today to discuss a childcare position. When I arrived, she pretended not to know who I was and refused to acknowledge our agreement. I showed her my confirmation email, my credentials, everything. She used racial slurs against me. I have it recorded. That should have been the moment when Callahan's approach to this situation shifted, when he should have recognized that maybe the white homeowner's story wasn't the full truth and that maybe this required actual investigation rather than just accepting the word of the person who'd called 911, but instead Callahan had responded with dismissive skepticism. You're saying you have an appointment, but the homeowner says she's never seen you before. Do you have proof? Tanisha had pulled out her phone immediately, had navigated to the confirmation email from her agency that had Melissa's full name, her address, the date and time of their scheduled meeting, all the details that should have been conclusive proof that Tanisha had every right to be at that address, and had held the phone out for Callahan to examine. He glanced at it for maybe 10 seconds, had barely read the content, and had responded with, this could be faked. Anyone can send themselves an email, which was such a bad faith reading of the evidence that even Walsh had looked uncomfortable, had shifted her weight in that way that suggested she disagreed with her partner's assessment but wasn't going to say so out loud. Tanisha had tried another approach, had offered, call my agency. They'll confirm everything. Premier Childcare Services, the number is on my employee ID, and had held up her official agency identification badge with her photo and her credentials clearly displayed, which was another piece of evidence that supported her story and contradicted Melissa's claims. Walsh had finally spoken up, had said quietly to her partner, Brett, maybe we should verify with the agency before, but Callahan had cut her off with clear irritation in his voice, had said, the homeowner says this woman is lying. I believe her, and that statement right there, captured on his body camera with perfect clarity, would later be used as evidence of his bias and his failure to conduct a proper investigation before making an arrest, because he'd explicitly stated that he was believing the white homeowner's claims over the black woman's documented evidence without doing any actual verification or investigation to determine which party was telling the truth. Tanisha had called him out on that bias directly, had said with frustration and fear evident in her voice, "You believe her why? Because she's white and I'm black? I have documentation. I have recordings of her using racial slurs. She's lying to you." And Callahan's response had been to dismiss her accusation entirely and to frame her very reasonable question about racial bias as an unreasonable attack on his integrity. "Ma'am, you're currently on a public street, but you've been accused of trespassing and harassment. The homeowner wants you to leave the neighborhood. I'm going to need to see your ID and then you need to go." She'd provided her driver's license, which Callahan had run through his system and which had come back completely clean. No warrants, no prior arrests, no indication whatsoever that she was the kind of person who went around harassing homeowners, and when he'd returned her ID she'd said with as much composure as she could maintain, "I'm leaving now. I was already leaving when you arrived. I'm going straight to my agency to report what happened." And she'd started to get back into her car because she'd complied with everything the officers had asked, had provided identification, had explained her presence, and was now voluntarily departing exactly as Callahan had instructed. But that voluntary compliance apparently wasn't enough for Melissa, who'd been watching this entire interaction from her porch and who'd apparently decided that having Tanisha simply leave wasn't sufficient punishment for the crime of being black and showing up for a job interview, because she'd shouted across the street, "She's trying to leave. She threatened me. Aren't you going to do anything?" And that shout, that demand that the officers do more than just ensure Tanisha departed, had been the catalyst for Callahan's decision to escalate this situation from a civil dispute that was being resolved peacefully into a criminal arrest that had no legal justification. "Ma'am, step away from the vehicle," Callahan had ordered, and when Tanisha had turned to look at him with confusion and growing alarm, he'd added, "You're under arrest for criminal trespass and harassment," which made no sense given that she was on a public street and had been in the process of leaving when he'd stopped her, and Tanisha's response had captured her absolute shock at this development. "What? I'm leaving. I was already leaving. You're arresting me for what?" Callahan's explanation had been pure circular logic that wouldn't survive 5 minutes of legal scrutiny. "You were on private property after being told to leave. That's trespassing. Turn around." Tanisha had tried to make him understand that his facts were wrong, had said, "I left as soon as she told me to. I was in my car about to drive away. This is false arrest." But Callahan had already made his decision and wasn't interested in facts or evidence or the obvious problem with arresting someone for trespassing when they're no longer on the property in question and are actively leaving, and he'd begun physically turning her around for handcuffing while saying, "Turn around," in a tone that suggested her continued protests were resistance that could justify force. She'd complied with the physical positioning because she understood that resisting could mean anything an officer wanted it to mean and could result in additional charges or in violence. But she'd continued to verbally protest. "I'm not resisting. But this is wrong. Call my agency. Verify my story," and Callahan's response had been to classify her completely legitimate protests as resistance in and of itself. "You're resisting right now by arguing," which was an absurd characterization but one that gave him justification in his own mind and in his later report for treating her as non-compliant even though she was standing still and allowing him to handcuff her without any physical resistance whatsoever. The handcuffs had clicked into place, metal biting into her wrists, and Tanisha had been crying by this point, had been saying through tears, "This is because I'm black. You're arresting me because she lied and you automatically believed her," and Callahan's response of, "You're being arrested because you committed a crime. Race has nothing to do with it," would have been laughable if the situation weren't so serious, because race had everything to do with it. Race was why Melissa had rejected Tanisha in the first place. Race was why Melissa had felt comfortable using slurs and making false accusations, and race was why Callahan had believed Melissa's lies over Tanisha's documented evidence. Walsh had watched this entire arrest process with visible discomfort, had looked like she wanted to say something but couldn't quite bring herself to challenge her partner directly, and her silence in that moment had made her complicit in what was happening even though she herself hadn't made the decision to arrest. Tanisha had been placed in the back of the patrol car, had sat there handcuffed and crying while her own car sat on the street with her purse and her belongings inside, and she'd made one more attempt to get these officers to verify her story. "My recording will prove everything. She used racial slurs. She refused service based on my race. This is all documented." Callahan's response had been dismissive and procedural. "You'll have a chance to tell your story at the station." Right now you're in custody," and with that he'd closed the door of the patrol car and had walked back over to Melissa to let her know that he'd arrested the woman who'd harassed her, and Melissa's expression of satisfaction and vindication had been captured on body camera footage that would later be used as evidence of her malicious intent and her knowing participation in a false arrest. Across the street, Caroline Winters had recorded portions of this encounter on her phone, had captured footage showing Tanisha's calm demeanor and voluntary departure and the officers stopping her when she was already leaving. And that footage would later corroborate Tanisha's version of events and would help establish that Callahan's arrest had been unjustified and had been based on bias rather than on any actual criminal behavior. But in the moment, Tanisha had just sat in that patrol car in handcuffs, had experienced the absolute helplessness of being detained by people with power over you who've decided to use that power against you for reasons that have nothing to do with justice or law enforcement or public safety, and had understood with terrible clarity that doing everything right, having documentation, having credentials, having evidence, being professional and compliant, meant nothing when you were black and when the people with badges had decided you were guilty. What did this story mean to you? Drop your thoughts in the comments, hit like and subscribe to Bold Black Watch TV for more powerful black stories. The call that would ultimately unravel Melissa Thornton's lies and Brett Callahan's biased policing came at 4:30 p.m. when Tanisha was allowed to make her one phone call from the police station, and she'd used it to contact Premier Childcare Services and ask for her supervisor, Director Constance Phillips, a woman who'd built her career on protecting the agency's employees and who had zero tolerance for clients who abused or discriminated against the people who worked for her. Tanisha's voice had been shaking when Constance had answered, had been thick with tears and stress as she'd explained, "I was arrested. The Thornton assignment," she refused to honor the agreement, used racial slurs, called police with false claims. "I'm at the police station now. They're charging me with trespassing and harassment." Constance's response had been immediate and forceful, had cut through Tanisha's distress with the kind of focused competence that came from years of handling difficult situations. "What? Melissa Thornton? I have all the documentation of her request, the phone interview, everything. Hold on. Don't say anything else to anyone until I get our attorney there. We're going to fix this." She'd hung up and had immediately begun pulling files, had assembled within 10 minutes a comprehensive package of evidence that proved beyond any possible doubt that Tanisha had been at the correct address for a legitimate, scheduled business appointment that Melissa Thornton herself had initiated and arranged. The evidence package included Melissa's original application to the agency, filled out 3 days earlier with her full name, address, phone number, and detailed information about her childcare needs, all in her own handwriting and bearing her signature. It included the recorded phone interview between Melissa and Tanisha from Wednesday afternoon. The agency recorded all client nanny interviews for quality assurance and liability purposes, and that recording captured 45 minutes of Melissa asking Tanisha detailed questions about her experience and qualifications, discussing schedule and compensation, and explicitly agreeing to meet on Friday at 3:30 p.m. at her home address to finalize the arrangement. The package also included the confirmation emails that had been sent to both Melissa and Tanisha after the phone interview, official communications from the agency that laid out the meeting details and included standard disclaimers and information about the agency's policies. It included the background check authorization that Melissa had signed, giving the agency permission to conduct and share employment screening information about Tanisha, which meant Melissa had been invested enough in hiring Tanisha to complete significant paperwork and to wait for background check results. And perhaps most importantly, it included reference to the fact that Tanisha had a personal recording of her interaction with Melissa that captured racial slurs and explicit statements of discrimination. Constance had called the police station, had asked to speak with whoever was supervising Tanisha's case, and had been connected to the desk sergeant who was processing the arrest paperwork. She'd identified herself as Tanisha's employer and had explained the situation with the kind of controlled anger that made it clear this wasn't going to be quietly dropped or easily dismissed. "My employee was arrested for trespassing and harassment, but those charges are completely false. She was at the Thornton residence for a scheduled business appointment that Mrs. Thornton herself initiated through our agency. I'm emailing you right now comprehensive documentation proving this, including recorded phone interviews and signed paperwork from Mrs. Thornton. I'm also informing you that my employee recorded her interaction with Mrs. Thornton and that recording captures racial slurs and a false police report being made." The desk sergeant, a career officer named Patricia Morgan who'd seen enough questionable arrests in her 20 years on the force to recognize when something didn't smell right, had reviewed the arrest report while pulling up the email from Constance, and the disconnect between what she was reading in the arrest report and what the documentation from the agency was showing had been immediately obvious and deeply concerning. The arrest report claimed that Tanisha had shown up at a residence where she wasn't expected, had refused to leave when asked, and had made threatening statements to the homeowner, but the agency's documentation showed that Tanisha had been explicitly invited to that address, had every right to be there, and had left voluntarily when asked. Sergeant Morgan had brought the situation to the attention of Captain Douglas Hayes, the shift commander, and had laid out the problem with unusual bluntness. "Sir, we've got a situation with the Thornton arrest. The woman Officer Callahan arrested claims she was there for a legitimate business meeting, and her employer has provided documentation that backs up her story completely. They've got recorded phone interviews, signed paperwork, confirmation emails, everything suggesting this woman had every right to be at that address and that the homeowner is lying about not knowing her." Captain Hayes had reviewed the materials with growing concern, had watched the body camera footage from Callahan's arrest and had noted how little investigation Callahan had done before deciding to believe the homeowner's accusations, and had made the decision to have Tanisha's phone, which had been seized as evidence during booking, examined immediately to determine if there really was a recording of the interaction that had preceded the arrest. The phone had been unlocked with Tanisha's consent, provided through her attorney who'd arrived by this point, and the voice recording had been played in Captain Hayes's office with Sergeant Morgan, the agency's attorney, and several other supervisors present as witnesses. The recording had been devastating to Melissa's credibility and to the justification for Tanisha's arrest, had captured with perfect audio clarity exactly what had happened on that porch and had proven beyond any possible doubt that Melissa had lied to the 911 dispatcher and to the responding officers. The recording started with Tanisha's professional greeting and Melissa's immediate cold rejection, captured Tanisha's increasingly confused attempts to understand why Melissa was pretending not to know her, and then recorded Melissa's escalating hostility culminating in the moment when she'd said, with her voice clear and unmistakable, "I'm not letting some N*** are into my house around my children. You people always think you're entitled to everything. I'm not having an ape taking care of my kids. Get off my property before I call the police." The racial slurs had been shocking enough, but what had followed had been even more legally problematic, because the recording had captured Melissa making her false 911 call and had documented her lies in real time, claiming Tanisha had threatened her when no threat had been made, claiming Tanisha had refused to leave when Tanisha had already been walking away, claiming she was scared when her tone throughout the interaction had been one of aggressive hostility rather than fear. The recording proved that Melissa had knowingly made false statements to police for the purpose of having Tanisha arrested, which was the crime of filing a false police report, and it showed that the entire basis for Tanisha's arrest had been fabricated. Captain Hayes's reaction, once he'd listened to the full recording and had reviewed all the supporting documentation, had been a combination of anger at Melissa for lying and concern about the department's liability for arresting someone based on those lies without proper investigation. "This is a disaster. She recorded everything? Every slur, every false statement." The agency's attorney had confirmed every word. "My client has clear evidence of racial discrimination, false police report, and wrongful arrest. Officer Callahan was shown documentation that my client had legitimate business at that address, and he chose to believe the white homeowner's lies over documented evidence. He made no attempt to verify her story with the agency, made no attempt to investigate whether the trespassing claim even made sense given that my client was already leaving. This is a civil rights violation and the city is going to be liable." The review of Callahan's body camera footage had supported the attorney's characterization of what had happened, had shown Callahan barely glancing at the evidence Tanisha had provided, had captured him explicitly stating, "The homeowner says this woman is lying. I believe her," without doing any verification, and had documented him arresting Tanisha even though she was already in the process of leaving voluntarily. It was indefensible policing, the kind of biased, lazy law enforcement that civil rights lawsuits are built on, and Captain Hayes had recognized immediately that the department needed to cut its losses and distance itself from this arrest as quickly as possible. "Release her immediately," Hayes had ordered. "Drop all charges. And I want Officer Callahan in my office first thing tomorrow morning." Sergeant Morgan had processed Tanisha's release personally, had returned her belongings with an apology that was professional but that didn't quite capture the magnitude of what had been done to her, and Tanisha had walked out of that police station after 3 hours in custody with no charges filed but with the psychological and emotional damage of having been handcuffed and arrested and treated like a criminal for the offense of showing up to a job interview while black. But Constance and the agency's attorney had made it clear that releasing Tanisha and dropping charges was just the beginning, not the end of this situation. And the next morning Premier Childcare Services had held a press conference that would transform this from a local incident into a national news story. Director Constance Phillips had stood at a podium with Tanisha beside her, and she'd explained to assembled reporters exactly what had happened and exactly what evidence existed to prove it. Our employee, Tanisha Reeves, was subjected to racist abuse, false accusations, and wrongful arrest while conducting legitimate business that the client herself had initiated. We have comprehensive documentation proving this, including Melissa Thornton's signed application for our services, a recorded phone interview where Mrs. Thornton explicitly scheduled a meeting with Ms. Reeves, and a recording that Ms. Reeves made of their interaction which captures racial slurs and the false police report being filed. Constance had played excerpts from the recording, appropriately censored for broadcast media but still shocking in their naked racism, and had shown copies of the documentary evidence that proved Melissa had hired Tanisha and had then lied about it when Tanisha showed up. The agency's attorney had announced their intention to file a lawsuit against both Melissa Thornton and Officer Brett Callahan, seeking $12 million in damages for racial discrimination, defamation, false imprisonment, civil rights violations, and intentional infliction of emotional distress, with $8 million being sought from Melissa and $4 million from the officer and the police department. The story had gone viral within hours, had been picked up by local news and then national news and then social media where it had spread with the particular velocity that stories about racist white women calling the police on black people always seem to generate. The phrase, "white woman calls cops on black nanny she hired," had trended on Twitter, and internet sleuths had quickly identified Melissa Thornton and had begun examining her social media presence, discovering posts that showed a pattern of racial resentment and coded language about neighborhood safety and property values. That suddenly made much more sense in light of what she'd said to Tanisha and what she'd been willing to do to keep a black woman out of her house. The neighbor's video footage had surfaced too. Caroline Winters had initially been reluctant to get involved but had ultimately provided her recording to investigators after being contacted by the agency's attorney, and that footage had shown Tanisha's calm, professional demeanor throughout the encounter, had shown her backing away from Melissa's porch and getting into her car to leave, had captured the arrest happening even though Tanisha was voluntarily departing exactly as the officers had instructed. The video had corroborated every element of Tanisha's story and had contradicted every element of Melissa's claims, and it had provided visual evidence to accompany the audio recording in a package of documentation that made this case essentially impossible for the defendants to win. Officer Callahan's history had been examined by journalists and activists and had revealed a pattern of complaints about racially biased policing that the department had consistently dismissed or minimized, complaints from black residents who'd been stopped without cause or who'd been treated more aggressively than white residents in similar situations, and the revelation of that pattern had transformed the narrative from one bad arrest into systemic problem with racist policing in ways that created political pressure for accountability and reform beyond just this individual case. If powerful stories, voices, and black triumphs matter to you, subscribe to Bold Black Watch TV. Like, comment, and share so these stories travel further. The legal and professional consequences that followed the exposure of Melissa Thornton's racism and Brett Callahan's biased policing came swiftly and comprehensively, demonstrating what can happen when victims of discrimination have strong institutional support, clear documentation, and legal representation that's willing to pursue justice aggressively rather than accepting easy settlements that would bury the evidence and protect the perpetrators from public accountability. Melissa Thornton faced criminal charges first. The district attorney had reviewed the evidence and had determined that her false statements to the 911 dispatcher constituted the crime of filing a false police report, a misdemeanor that carried potential jail time and that, more importantly, would give her a criminal record that would follow her for the rest of her life. She'd hired an expensive defense attorney who tried to argue that this had all been a misunderstanding, and that Melissa had genuinely believed she was being threatened. But that defense had collapsed immediately when prosecutors had played the audio recording that captured Melissa's voice being identical to the voice on the recorded phone interview with Tanisha, and that proved definitively that Melissa had known exactly who Tanisha was and why she was at her door. Faced with evidence that made a trial unwinnable, Melissa had accepted a plea deal that allowed her to avoid jail time but that required her to plead guilty to filing a false police report, to accept a 6-month suspended sentence with 2 years of probation, to perform 200 hours of community service working with organizations that serve communities of color, and to make a public apology acknowledging her racism and her false accusations. That public apology, delivered at a press conference with her attorney standing beside her looking deeply uncomfortable, had been halting and clearly coerced, had included admissions that, "I used racial slurs against Ms. Reeves, that I lied to police about being threatened, and that my actions were motivated by racial prejudice that I am now working to address. But the words had rung hollow because everyone watching could see that Melissa was sorry she'd been caught and sorry she was facing consequences, not actually sorry for what she'd done to Tanisha. The civil lawsuit had proceeded separately from the criminal case, and it had been clear from early in the process that Melissa had no real defense against the discrimination and defamation claims because the evidence was too comprehensive and too damning for any jury to side with her. Her attorney had tried to negotiate a settlement that would keep the details private and would minimize the payout, but Premier Childcare Services and Tanisha's legal team had rejected those attempts because they wanted public accountability and they wanted a settlement large enough to send a message that this kind of racism and these kinds of false accusations had serious financial consequences. The settlement that was ultimately reached, after months of legal maneuvering and discovery that had unearthed even more evidence of Melissa's racial bias, including text messages to friends where she'd made racist comments about people in her neighborhood, had required Melissa to pay $8 million in damages, a sum that was deliberately calculated to be larger than her homeowner's insurance policy would cover, and that would require her to liquidate personal assets and potentially declare bankruptcy. The Thorntons had been forced to sell their house in Westbrook Estates at a loss because the neighborhood association had made it clear they were no longer welcome in the community, had downsized to a much smaller home in a less expensive area, and had become social pariahs as word spread about what Melissa had done, and as people who'd previously considered her a friend had distanced themselves from the association with someone whose racism had been so publicly exposed. Officer Brett Callahan's consequences had been both administrative and criminal, because his wrongful arrest of Tanisha had violated both department policy and federal civil rights law in ways that made him personally liable and that made continued employment as a police officer impossible. The internal affairs investigation that Captain Hayes had ordered had found that Callahan had failed to conduct a proper investigation before making an arrest, had ignored readily available evidence that contradicted the homeowner's claims, had shown clear bias in automatically believing a white accuser over a black defender despite documentary evidence, and had violated department standards for professional conduct and impartial policing. He'd been suspended immediately and then had been fired after the internal affairs investigation had concluded, losing not just his job but also his pension because the violations had been serious enough to constitute termination for cause rather than a resignation that would have preserved his retirement benefits. The termination had been appealed by the police union, which had initially tried to defend Callahan by arguing that he'd made a good faith error in judgment. But that defense had become untenable once the full scope of the evidence had been presented and once the union's leadership had recognized that defending this case would damage their credibility and their ability to defend officers in future cases that were actually defensible. The federal investigation into whether Callahan had violated Tanisha's civil rights had resulted in criminal charges being filed against him under Section 242 of Title 18, which makes it a federal crime for anyone acting under color of law to willfully deprive a person of their constitutional rights. The case against him had been strong because the body camera footage and the audio recording together had established that he'd arrested Tanisha without probable cause, that he'd ignored evidence of her legitimate presence at that address, and that his decision-making had been influenced by racial bias in ways that constituted a knowing violation of her Fourth Amendment protection against unreasonable seizure and her 14th Amendment right to equal protection under the law. Callahan had eventually accepted a plea deal that allowed him to avoid a trial that would have been both humiliating and that he likely would have lost, pleading guilty to a single count of deprivation of rights under color of law in exchange for a sentence of 2 years in federal prison followed by 3 years of supervised release. The plea deal had also required him to agree not to contest the civil lawsuit and to cooperate with the settlement process, and the ultimate civil settlement had been $4 million paid jointly by Callahan personally, though he had no realistic ability to pay this and would likely declare bankruptcy, his professional liability insurance, and the city of San Jose, which was liable for the actions of its employees. Officer Jennifer Walsh, Callahan's partner who'd been present during the arrest but who hadn't been the primary decision-maker, had faced lesser consequences: a formal reprimand in her personnel file, mandatory retraining on bias in policing and on the duty to intervene when a partner is engaging in misconduct, and a transfer to a different assignment away from street patrol. But she'd kept her job because investigators had determined that while she should have pushed back harder against Callahan's decision-making, she hadn't been the instigator of the wrongful arrest and had shown appropriate discomfort with how the situation had been handled. The $12 million in settlements, $8 million from Melissa and $4 million from the city and the defendants in the police misconduct case, had been awarded to Tanisha, but she'd made it clear from the beginning that this wasn't just about financial compensation for her, That it was about accountability and about using her experience to create change that would protect other people from experiencing what she'd experienced. She'd used a portion of the settlement money to buy a house for herself and her mother Lorraine, finally fulfilling the promise she'd made to herself years ago that her mother would never have to worry about housing security or would never have to work herself to exhaustion just to keep a roof over their heads. She'd used another portion to pay for comprehensive medical care for her mother's diabetes, ensuring that Lorraine had access to the best treatment and management strategies and wouldn't have to ration insulin or skip doctor's appointments because of cost concerns. She'd established a scholarship fund that would provide financial support for childcare workers who wanted to pursue higher education in early childhood development or related fields, creating pathways for people in her profession to advance their careers and increase their earning potential. And she'd founded an advocacy organization called Nannies Against Discrimination that provided legal support, documentation training, and community resources for domestic workers who experienced racism or exploitation from employers, because she knew that her case had only been winnable because she'd had strong institutional support from her agency and because she'd had the presence of mind to record the interaction, and she wanted to make sure that other workers in similar situations would have support and resources even if they didn't work for agencies as protective as Premier Childcare had been. Tanisha had continued working as a nanny. She'd been promoted within Premier Childcare to their highest compensation tier and had been placed with a lovely biracial family who treated her with genuine respect and appreciation, because she loved the work and because she refused to let Melissa Thornton's racism drive her out of the profession she'd chosen and excelled in. She'd become a national spokesperson for workplace discrimination issues, had been invited to speak at conferences and on news programs, and had used her platform to talk about the particular vulnerabilities that domestic workers faced when their workplaces were private homes and when their employers had enormous power to make their lives difficult without oversight or accountability. 1 year after the arrest, Tanisha had stood at a podium at a national conference on employment discrimination and had told her story to an audience of lawyers, activists, policymakers, and other workers who'd experienced similar treatment, and her words had captured something essential about what she'd been through and what it meant. I was doing everything right. I had a degree from a respected university. I had years of experience and excellent references. I had documentation proving I was supposed to be at that address. Confirmation emails, phone records, my agency ID. I was professional and calm even when I was being screamed at and called slurs. I recorded the evidence that would later prove my case. And none of it mattered in that moment, because a white woman saw my face and decided I wasn't human enough to care for her children, and because a white cop saw me and decided I must be lying despite having evidence right in front of him that I was telling the truth. She paused then, had let that reality sink in for her audience before continuing, "That's what we're still fighting. The assumption that black people are inherently suspicious, that our presence in certain spaces must be challenged, that when white people accuse us of wrongdoing we must be guilty regardless of what evidence exists to the contrary. But I'm still here. I won. And I'm using my voice and my resources to make sure that other people in similar situations know they can fight back, that documentation matters, that recording evidence matters, that having institutional support matters, and that justice is possible even when the system seems designed to protect the people who harmed you." The final scene of this story takes place in the comfortable living room of the family Tanisha now works for, where their 2 children, a 6-year-old boy and a 4-year-old girl, run to hug her when she arrives in the morning, calling her Auntie Tanisha, with genuine affection, where the parents treat her as a valued professional rather than as domestic help, where she's respected and appreciated for the expertise and care she brings to their family. This is what Melissa Thornton's children missed out on. The opportunity to be cared for by someone educated and experienced and loving, someone who would have enriched their lives and taught them things their racist mother never could, because Melissa had decided that her prejudices were more important than her children's well-being. Melissa Thornton herself, in her smaller house in her less prestigious neighborhood with her damaged reputation and her criminal record, occasionally thinks about the $8 million she had to pay and the life she lost because she couldn't overcome her racism long enough to simply honor an agreement she'd made. And sometimes she tells herself that she was the real victim in all of this, that she was unfairly persecuted for expressing preferences about who she wanted in her home, that political correctness had destroyed her life over a simple misunderstanding. But late at night, when she's honest with herself in ways she rarely is, she knows the truth, that she destroyed her own life by being exactly as racist as she'd always been but finally getting caught doing it, and that every consequence she faced was deserved and was small compared to what she tried to do to Tanisha. Officer Brett Callahan, serving his federal prison sentence in a facility where his status as a former police officer makes him a target for violence from other inmates who have their own histories with abusive cops, has plenty of time to reflect on the decision he made to believe a white homeowner's lies over a black woman's documented evidence. And sometimes he tells himself that he was just doing his job and following his training and that he couldn't have known the homeowner was lying. But he knows that's not true, knows that he had evidence right in front of him that should have made him investigate further before making an arrest, knows that his decision was influenced by the same racial biases that had characterized his entire career, and knows that he's not in prison because he made one innocent mistake but because he abused his authority based on racist assumptions one time too many and finally faced a victim who had the resources to fight back. And Tanisha Reeves, the woman who'd been arrested for knocking on the wrong door except it was actually the right door and the only wrong thing that had happened was that a racist homeowner and a biased cop had decided that a black woman couldn't possibly belong where she had every right to be, continues her work as a nanny and as an advocate, continues to use her platform to fight for other domestic workers and other victims of discrimination, and continues to prove every single day that doing the right thing and fighting for justice and refusing to accept that racism and false accusations should go unpunished can actually lead to victory and accountability and change. The text that appears on screen as this story ends reads, Melissa Thornton filed for bankruptcy in 2025 and continues to serve her probation. Officer Brett Callahan is currently serving his federal prison sentence and will be released in 2027. Tanisha Reeves continues her work as a nanny and her advocacy through Nannies Against Discrimination, which has helped over 150 childcare workers fight workplace discrimination and has recovered over $3 million in settlements for workers who experienced racism or exploitation from employers. And the final message, the thematic truth that this story illuminates, is this: racism doesn't just hurt its victims, it eventually destroys its perpetrators too, especially when those victims refuse to accept injustice quietly and when they have the documentation, the support, and the determination to fight back until accountability is achieved. Tanisha knocked on what Melissa called the wrong door, but it was actually the exact right door she was supposed to be at, and the only thing wrong was that the people on the other side of that door couldn't see past their own prejudices long enough to recognize that the woman standing there was exactly who she said she was and deserved exactly the respect and dignity that every human being deserves regardless of what they look like or where they come from. That's the lesson. That's the victory. And that's why this story, painful as it is in its documentation of racism and police complicity, is ultimately a story of triumph, because the victim became a victor, because the perpetrators faced consequences, because justice was possible when it so often isn't, and because one woman's refusal to accept that she deserved to be treated this way led to changes that will protect countless others from experiencing the same nightmare she endured.